Welcome to part one of the series where I will go over every single car that I plan to have on my YouTube channel someday. I do plan on doing this YouTube thing for a long time. Maybe I'll be a 55-year-old man still making YouTube videos with my cars, and that would be awesome. You know, that sounds like it'd be a great life. So, you guys have heard me talk about this car several times on my channel before, and the reason I'm so connected to it, I don't think anyone's going to really expect this, but my dad owned this car when he met my mom when I was 4 years old. He had a 1990 Ford Probe GT. That's pretty obscure, right? I remember looking at that car and thinking how cool it was. Unfortunately, when my dad moved back to the States, there was a problem with the Probe, and he got a job with the Postal Service, wasn't making enough money to repair it. So he parked it in the backyard of my grandparents' house, and then fast forward to when I was 16 years old when we were trying to take it out. My grandfather was able to get it started. I had never driven a manual car before, but my dad taught me, and I stalled it a couple times, and then we ended up taking it down the road and back. Well, one of the biggest problems was that the turbo was leaking or something like that. I can't remember. That was 9 years ago now. But we ended up taking it to my high school to get it looked at the auto shop. They told us the whole entire frame was rotten, and that there was an oil leak from the turbo that was leaking into the engine or something like that. It was just all bad, okay? So we ended up junking it, and from that point forward, I told myself that one day I will have one of those cars, just like the one my dad had. All right, so let me introduce the car to you.
Ford started with Mazda's newly introduced MX-6 Sport Coupe, modified it to their taste, and gave it back for assembly in a Mazda-run American plant.
So basically, Ford very briefly, in the late 80s, started a campaign to replace the Mustang with this Probe. And immediately, they received a lot of feedback from Mustang owners saying that you cannot do this. We will disown you. You cannot replace the Mustang. So it ended up being its own thing, and they called it the Probe. And it was the same chassis as the Mazda 626 because it uses a Mazda 2.2-liter turbocharged engine making 145 horsepower and 190 pound-feet of torque. That doesn't sound like a lot, but it only weighs about 2,700 pounds. For 1989, that little car was able to go from 0 to 60 in around 7.5 seconds, in a quarter mile in 15.3 seconds at 92 miles per hour. That's not too bad considering a 2020 Honda Civic Si with 205 horsepower goes 0 to 60 in about 6.5 seconds and quarter mile time of, like 14.9, 15 seconds flat. Even by today's standards, that's a fun car, right? So right here on CurbsideClassic.com, I was able to find a good example of a white one that looked just like my dad's. If I have it my way, this year, 2021, I will buy a 1989 to 1992 Ford Probe GT. The problem is right now, they are very hard to find. I only found one first-gen Probe for sale in the entire United States. I remember going on Craigslist last year, early 2020, and finding one of these that was for sale in Reno, Nevada, and that's only about a 2-hour drive away from me. And they only wanted like $2,000 for it, and apparently it had a bunch of recent maintenance work and stuff like that. But I just couldn't afford to drop that cash at that time. I was focusing on building my attention, and I just had other priorities. Looking back, it would have been really cool if I would have picked that up. But I'll tell you what, be prepared to see that car on my channel because it is coming as soon as I can find one. I promise you. So for modifications for this car, this is going to be the tough part. It is going to be a very interesting build because the only thing I could find was an eBay cold air intake for $45, an aftermarket intake manifold, and for everything else, it'll have to be custom made or I don't even know. But there are 0 exhaust systems for the first-gen Probe available. I'm not even sure what tuning hardware I'll need. I was able to find an example of one on probetalk.com. This guy was able to get 350 horsepower out of a stock engine. At least I have some good documentation to go off of, and maybe I can find some people out there that will be able to help me build this car when I do get it, as soon as I can get it. And before I move on to the second one, I do want to say, yes, I am aware that the second gen probe has a better aftermarket scene, and there are lots more of those driving around today. That doesn't make me want it. I want the first gen because I have the emotional connection to it, and because it'll mean something to me, and because pop-up headlights. Vivian!
What?
Pop-up headlights!
Pop up and down headlights.
Moving on to number 2. I was 6 years old when I first saw this car in action. It's 2001. Pretty sure you guys can already guess what it is.
The front-drive GST and the all-wheel drive GSX. The entry-level RS and mid-scale GS complete the American-made Eclipse lineup.
A 1995 to 1999 Mitsubishi Eclipse, or an Eagle Talon, or a Plymouth Laser, really. Although the Plymouth Laser was nixed in 1994. So these cars have an early version of the 4G63 turbo engine that we find in the Evos. So it has 210 horsepower, 214 pound-feet of torque in the manual. The GST was able to run from 0 to 60 in 6.7 seconds, a quarter mile of 15.2 at 94 miles per hour. And for some reason, the GSX, which is the all-wheel drive version, pretty sure it's just because it's a lot heavier, it went 0 to 60 in 7 seconds, quarter mile of 15.5 and 89 miles an hour. So you're telling me that on paper, the first gen Probe GT is faster in the quarter mile than the Mitsubishi Eclipse GSX. That's according to the data that I was able to find. I love the looks of this car, and I have thought about, I have daydreamed of making a tribute car to the Fast and Furious 1, but that's already been done a few times, and it's already been documented pretty well, and I think I would like to make my own unique build. Someone who has a really good set of videos on these cars is Miguel DSM, but it doesn't mean I can't come along and do my own thing. So this car has a pretty good aftermarket support. I mean, you have your exhaust systems, intakes, your intake manifolds, suspension, everything. The thing about this car, they hold their value pretty well because people are into them. I'm talking about the GST and the GSX. They're pretty popular tuner cars still to this day. To get one that's not a total piece of crap, it's probably gonna cost me around $10,000, give or take. These cars will break down constantly, but they are easier to find than the Probe GT. And my plans for these cars, I would like to get the most that I can out of the stock engine and the stock turbo before I start upgrading things. If anything, since these cars are going to be so old, and you guys know how I like to drive my cars, I don't think those stock components will last too long. So they're both probably going to be pretty expensive. And before I move on to number 3, this list is in no particular order. I do think for sure the first one that I will get will be the Ford Probe, because they're just so cheap and they're so rare, so that I'm going to make sure I set money aside so that when one pops up, I'm going to grab it immediately. Number 3, this is another Mitsubishi. This is the Mitsubishi Evo, but the first generation, or the Galant VR4, which they're almost the same thing. This is a car that I first gained interest in when I saw Evan Shanks get his, he got his a few months ago, and I've been watching Evan since he had his Scion TC when I was in high school. I knew the Evo 8 was the first one available in the US in 2003, but the Evo 1 through 3, I think they're just awesome. I love the looks. I'm kind of obsessed with 80s and 90s cars. So let's take a look at this one right here, and then I'll talk about the specs. JDMexpo.com. Let's take a look at this yellow one for sale. This is a Mitsubishi, this is an Evo 3, 124,000 kilometers, and the price, I mean, God, these are expensive. $34,000. But it costs a lot of money to import these, so I understand. But this is beautiful. I think I would try to avoid getting a yellow one because I know Evan Shanks has a yellow one. I absolutely love the looks. Gorgeous car. And the rear end, I mean, that's just perfect. You don't see wings like that anymore. I mean, I don't even know if you can call it a spoiler. That is a wing. So a little bit of history about the Evo so we know what we're working with here. It was produced from 1992 to 2016. And it had 10 versions. It took the engine and the all-wheel drive drivetrain from the original Galant VR4. So that's why I said maybe I could get a Galant too. It's probably, it might be even less expensive than Evos, but there's none for sale right now in the US. The first Evo had 244 horsepower and 228 pound-feet of torque. So not bad for 1992. In 1993, we had the second version of the Evo. Power was increased to 252 horsepower. I think the looks are still really good. I mean, it didn't really change much. And the Evo 3, this one, I just think it looks the best out of all, the first generations. But in 1995, we saw the Evo 3, and that increased the horsepower to 270, and it still had 228 pound-feet of torque. And here's the thing, this car only weighed 2,624 pounds to a maximum of 2,778 pounds. That is super light for an all-wheel drive car like that. Fast forward to the Evo 10 that we see all over the place here in the US, and that car weighs like 3,600 pounds. This little car with proper modifications, a nice little tune, which is exactly what I would do to it. I wouldn't ruin it aesthetically, but I would have to lower it, maybe get some different wheels. It would have to get tint, all that type of stuff, the basic stuff. And then I would focus on power modifications, and then, I don't know, just have a lot of fun with it. Number 4, this is an American-made car, and I think you guys might have a slight idea what it is, but you're gonna be off by a little bit, because this car, I never talk about on my channel, but it's actually my favorite looking version of this American-made car. I'm talking about a C4 Corvette. The C4 Corvette ran from 1984 to 1996. I'm an enormous fan of pop-up headlights, and I'm really sad we can't have them anymore, but these days, due to government regulations and what engineers know about aerodynamics, I don't see them coming back, unfortunately. So let's take a look at the C4. There's a lot of information on this, so I'm gonna make it quick. Right now, these are the cheapest Corvettes in the market, and that's because they're not really in that like collector status that the C1 through C3s are, but at the same time, they're overshadowed by the C5 because the C5 is just a much better performer. But it doesn't mean these cars perform poorly. It just means that the C5, there's a huge gap. So I think out of all the cars that I've had on this list so far, this is the one that would probably be the best thing to bring some diversity to my channel. Who doesn't love V8 rear-wheel drive? I mean, if you have never driven a V8 rear-wheel drive American muscle car, then you need to. For those who still don't know, I did have a C5 Corvette at the very, very beginning of my channel. You can find a couple videos of it. I never really did anything exciting. I didn't really know how to record videos at that point, but it was a very fun car. Okay, so let's jump all the way down here to the year-by-year differences. This car came out with a 5.7 liter L83, and it only made 205 horsepower. And you guys have to remember, in the mid-70s, we had an oil crisis, and that is what drove automakers to greatly reduce the horsepower and try as best they can to increase fuel efficiency. In the beginning of the 80s and mid-80s is when manufacturers really started to come back from that. Basically, the first few years of the C4 Corvette is kind of a no-go for me. 1985, it went up to 230 horsepower. Cool. 1986, we got an extra 5 horsepower. 1987, it was ranked by Car and Driver as one of the top 10 cars for that year. It was also recognized by Motor Trend as the winner of the top speed, best braking, and best skid pad categories for 1987. That's impressive. And it only had 240 horsepower. In 1990, we saw the ZR1, and this engine was actually created by Lotus, or mostly by Lotus. So it was referred to as, I guess it still is referred to as kind of an exotic engine, which I assume would make working on that car kind of a nightmare. Buying parts would be more expensive, getting it worked on. So the ZR1's cool and all, but unless my channel completely explodes, then I'm not gonna be able to afford to have a car like that. I'm not even gonna be able to buy it. 1992, this is where it starts to get real, in my eyes. Chevrolet introduced the LT1 engine, and in 1992, it put out 300 horsepower and 330 pound-feet of torque. Now, let me get the specs for the 0 to 60 in the quarter mile. Okay, so according to roadandtrack.com, On a 100-degree day, the 1992 Corvette was able to go from 0 to 60 in 5.7 seconds and a quarter mile of 14.1 at 102 miles per hour. Think about it like this. My tension, when it was full bolt-on and running the variable tune, I ran 14.3 at the track at 102 miles per hour. Same trap speed, but I'm pretty sure the Corvette is able to launch better because it has those huge tires and has rear-wheel drive, so naturally it just launches a little better than the front-wheel drive. And just for the heck of it, I went to corvsport.com. According to them, the 1992 Corvette with the LT1, not the ZR1, the LT1, it did a quarter mile time of 13.9. So I guess it's around 14 seconds. But that makes me excited because that seems like it would be a lot of power, and that's stock. That's before I do anything. That's before I get it dyno tuned, and believe me, I will be doing a lot of stuff to that Corvette when I do get it. You guys will see that on my channel eventually one day, I promise. Okay, so basically, the best C4s to get are the 1995 and 1996. In 95, connecting rods were revised to improve strength and weight uniformity, and the engine fan was made quieter, and the fuel injection system was improved to utilize alcohol blend fuels, which began to have an increased appearance at gas pumps. And if you scroll down a little bit on corvsport.com, it has this really beautiful purple version. And you know what? I did a quick search on autotrader.com just to see what the market looks like right now. And I was able to find this one. 1993, obviously it's in a 6-speed manual. I will not be getting an automatic. It's got 82,000 miles, so, you know, has really not too many miles. It's listed for $13,000, and it is in Portland, Oregon. So I'd have to be really cautious about inspecting for rust. But, I mean, this is just gorgeous. I think the purple interior is, you know, a little too much purple. It would have been cool to have like a beige or white interior. I really like that. This is awesome. I would buy this. I would drive it. I would drag race it. I would do everything that I do with my Tension SI, but with a Corvette. I'm pretty sure you guys would enjoy seeing that. Yeah, and then we scroll down here. Corvettes right now are unfortunately overpriced, pretty much all of them, but especially the C4 and C5 right now. The Kelley Blue Book for this car ranges from $7,200 to $9,000, and they're asking $13,000. So unless it has a brand new everything, then I definitely wouldn't pay $13,000 for that. It's good to know KBB is staying strong and telling us that those values are realistic. Okay, I was gonna do a fifth one, but this is a super long video. I just have so much to say about all of these cars. I don't know how many I'll end up doing. Maybe I'll do, you know, 3 videos, maybe I'll do 4, but there are a ton of cars that I would love to own. I would love to have in the channel and do all the fun things that I did with the Tension and more, because I didn't even do anything aesthetically to the Tension. I really only did surface level stuff as far as bolt-on modifications. So promise you guys, starting with my Type R, my builds are going to get serious. I'll definitely do some wheel tire suspension with the Type R. Good stuff is coming. Let me know what your favorite car was on this list. I don't expect anyone to say the Probe, but that is my favorite one. Like I said, I'm gonna have money set aside, a few grand, so that when one does pop up, I'm gonna get it. That's all I have for this video. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.